Hey y'all, it's Miriam and I have something fun for you guys today, something special. Today we're painting this. Now I just finished. It took me just under an hour and I'm going to take you guys along with me for the whole process in real time. So you'll get the full demo. We'll talk about creating skin tones that pop, adding visual interest, building in looseness from the start, and really just kind of just having fun with it. Now, if you want to follow along with me, then I will go ahead and post the reference photo over on Patreon. So if you want to paint and download that reference, you can do that there. Now, speaking of Patreon, thank you guys to all of my wonderful, wonderful patrons out there. I appreciate you guys more than you know. You make these videos possible, so thank you. And along with that, if you want a demo on how I created this reference photo, that's over on Patreon as well. This reference and a lot of my references come from 3D scans of actual humans that I then pose, model, sculpt, and light over in Blender, which is a free 3D modeling software. So if you want that demo, that's also over on Patreon. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. All right, so the colors that I'm using here are raw umber, perylene red, cad red light, ivory black, yellow ochre, titanium white, and cremettes white. They're the same colors that I recently showed you in the video called My Go-To Palette over on Patreon. I've just been really loving this color palette. Just makes things nice and easy, and I'm all about speed these days. Now, the brush that I'm using is just it's a semi-stiff flat brush. And I'm using this brush to just kind of lay in the general outline, the silhouette of where my portrait's going to go. Now, normally I can rely on the white space around my painting to come up with accurate measurements, but I'm using oil paper today and it's kind of in an awkward size, and I didn't feel like going back and re-rendering my image into the exact dimensions. So I'm just having to do a little extra measuring here and adjusting. So that's what you see me do, why I was putting my thumb out like that. Now, one thing to know about working with oil paper is that it is extremely absorbent. So I'm using a lot more thinner than I normally would. And specifically right now I'm using Gamblin 3-in-1 to thin it out. Now, to be honest, the reason why I'm using the 3-in-1 is simply because I had it handy. Normally, I like to use the Sennelier Green for Oil non-toxic thinner, but I didn't have any today on hand. I just had the 3-in-1 and it worked pretty well, but I am normally very cautious about only using non-toxic materials throughout my painting process. So I just wanted to point that out. But when you're working with the oil paper, you typically want to get a nice kind of saturated layer down before you can even start to think about blending. So that's why I'm going in, and you can even see it dripping down my palette there, the paint, because I'm really kind of thinning that out. At this point, there's two things going on in my mind. One is silhouette and the second is shape. Now, I've showed this to you guys before. It's one of my new favorite tools that I've come across. It's the Proco Value Study tool, and just really helpful for breaking down your reference photo into those main shapes. I used to do this manually in Photoshop, and I've been searching for a good tool, and this one so far has been the best one that I found. So I'll link that down below. And so what I'm doing is looking at this posterized version of my reference, looking at where all the darks are, and then I'm just going to go in with, again, try and get that nice and saturated, nice thin layer of oil, and just rough in all of those dark areas. Now, this specific raw umber, I've talked about it before. This is the Old Holland brand of raw umber. It's my absolute favorite. It blends beautifully, it behaves beautifully, and I personally find quite a difference between the brands, especially when it comes to the raw umber. And this is the only one that I like to use. So you can see just how kind of even that raw umber is blending out there. So far, everything up until this point has either been painted or not painted. But what you're going to see me do now is start to add in even darker values. I'm just going in with a heavier hand. Now, as I go on in the painting process and I get more confident in the placement of my different features, I start to use darker paints, more saturated paints, and I paint with a heavier hand. So that's what you're going to see now. You're also going to see me kind of course correct in areas where I might have gone over. And so I'm going to use that dark line just as a placeholder, I guess, for later stages so that I know, hey, I went over in this area. You better cover it up later. The other important thing that's happening at this stage is I'm changing the way that I'm thinking about the painting. Up until this point, it's all been about shape and silhouette. Do I have the general shape of things down? But now that I'm starting to add in darker values, I'm starting to think about the depth of my portrait. So, in my mind, and I'm not saying this as an analogy, I mean this in the most literal sense. In my mind, I am thinking of this not as a flat piece of paper that I'm painting on, but rather a three-dimensional space and a portrait that exists within that 3D space that is taking up width, height, depth, and has weight to it. So I'm squinting my eyes. Go ahead and look at this and blur your eyes a little bit. Even with this very little information, you can start to get a sense of form. And that's what I'm doing. And everything from this point on is just trying to reinforce that feeling of depth. When I'm painting these areas darker in my mind, I'm not using that language. I'm not saying, oh, this area needs to be darker. The language that is being used in my head is this area needs to be pushed back further in space. All right. So that's pretty much that's what's going through my mind. All right. I would pretty much at this point consider my underpainting finished, or at least almost finished. I'm going to touch up just a few areas here, but really this is it. I'm just about ready to start the color mixing and move on to the next stage. Now, up until this point, we've used only the raw umber, and we were able to get a lot of information out of it. Now, one of my favorite reasons for using the raw umber in this sort of stage is that it plays well with so many other colors, and it's not too warm. It has sort of a greenish undertone, and that mixed with the red, I think makes really beautiful shadows. Now, speaking of red, why perylene red? Well, one is preference. I just like it. It's a fun color. It's one of the reddest reds I've ever found. But two, it's a completely transparent red. Now, let's compare that with the cad red light that's sitting next to it, which is very opaque. Um, the perylene red, especially when mixed with the raw umber, lets us build super dark, super transparent shadows. Now, the one pitfall with the perylene red, as you can see on the canvas right now, it is super saturated. It's super red. And like you can see, I just did there, I accidentally made it too red. So I had to go in and add just a little more raw umber to it. Now, it doesn't bother me too much, and in fact, I prefer to have a lot of warmth in my shadows, and that's because it's one of my favorite ways to avoid muddy skin tones. I often find that skin tones or well, at least one of the biggest pitfalls is people letting their skin tones die in the terminators. So when we transition from our light side of the face to the shadow side, when the lights and the darks mix, uh, what can happen is our skin tones gray out and they leave us with a face that looks muddy. And so to combat that, what I like to do is pack in saturation. I like to pack in the vibrancy so that when I'm mixing into that, I already have the warmth built into it. I don't have to worry about my skin tones getting too muddy. Now, this one is kind of a funky one, this portrait. I think in my reference, a lot of the reflected light, it has a lot warmer tones, and a lot of that is just the 3D rendering itself. I didn't want to go quite that warm in a lot of these areas, and I wanted to have sort of an eerie feeling, and so I'm cooling off a lot of the reflected light like that you see under the chin and some of those areas, and I just want to give it the idea of like this really pale skin bouncing off of it. I think once we add in the black background and we build in the actual skin tones, it's really going to make it pop and look nice. Now, as far as the skin tones go, I'm going to mix an an oversaturated version of what I want because I know I'm going to be mixing in. I'm going to be mixing my lights next to my darks, and I want to avoid muddy colors, so I'm going to oversaturate it in the beginning. So you're going to see I'm mixing titanium white, cremence white, a little cad red light, and yellow ochre to make those skin tones. Now, the cad red light is also very super saturated, and I'll often make, I've heard artists call it like a thread of colors, where you start really saturated on one side, a lot less on the others, and then you blend it in the middle to get sort of a gradient. So that's what you can see me doing right now. It's just kind of creating that gradient so that I can pull at any point from any of those colors. And at this point, I'm ready to start laying in those skin tones. This is one of the funnest parts for me. Now, again, this is going to look funky right now, but once we add in the black background, everything's just going to pop and it's going to instantly make it all look unified. So don't lose hope yet. I know a lot of people, they will show me their works and ask for advice. And the problem is they just quit too early. They got discouraged early on instead of just pushing through. And so even when something might look funky, see it out. See it out. And when in doubt, add contrast. That's my go-to. Now, I also want to point out I'm still just using the same brush for all of this. I'm using a brush. I typically like to use a brush the width of the eye. As I mentioned, this one's a little on the small side, but that's okay. And I'm not being too exact at all. I'm going over some of the places. I'm just kind of roughing it in. So at this point, I pretty much have everything covered on the face. And now I can start to think about rendering and blending and think about how these shapes are interlocking with into each other, how they're interacting with each other, and start thinking more about what I want those brush strokes to look like, because everything up until this point has just sort of been placement, right? The other thing I want to point out is there's no medium used in this. I got down that, pretty thin layer for my underpainting, but for as far as my lights go, um, this is mostly just the paint straight out of the tube. I haven't added any sort of medium. I think I might have dipped my brush in the thinner maybe once, but really not a lot. And yeah, now I can start to think about my third go on shape, right? And adjusting. And I'm just kind of repeating that process over and over again. And every time I repeat the process, I'm just thinking about how far off I am. Like right now, I'm restarting the process of looking at the perimeter of everything, and I just noticed that my shoulder was way too low, right? So just going in and fixing that. Now, one other thing that I want to point out is because this is a 3D render that I have manipulated and sculpted and posed. Um, it may not be 100% perfect, and I know um, that the neck, I might have stretched it a little long, but again, do I care? No, not really. I let go of perfection a long time ago, and 99.99% of the time, the people who are viewing it aren't going to notice either, and if they do, they're not going to care. Um, So I just wanted to point that out. A lot of times people, I feel like, get really hung up on their mistakes. And a lot of times they're only mistakes in your eyes. You know, your viewer is not viewing it the same way that you are. So at this point, I'm starting to feel good about everything. I'm liking the overall shape. I'm liking the overall sense of form. I'm liking the mix of colors. And now I can start on what is sometimes my favorite part and what is sometimes my most hated part. And that is the rendering of everything. And that's where, you know, I think for a lot of us, the portrait really starts to come to life. And for this, I am switching to a smaller brush. It is a round brush. It's a little more precise, and just really now honing in on everything. Um, Fixing the nose, start to add in a little bit of detail. But like I mentioned before, I am, the more detail you add, the more you have to add. So I'm also trying to find the balance. And believe it or not, this portrait is almost done. If you look at it now versus where I end it, there's just a few changes. I'm gonna add in the lips, and I fixed the nose just a tiny bit. But besides that, the actual portrait itself is most of it stays like this. It just makes a big difference once we add in that black background. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the further I get on, the more saturated my colors become and the darker they come. So that's, you can see me, working on the lips. I'm going to add in the nose, but as I do that, I'm working with really warm and rich colors. Now, I don't think that you guys want to listen to me yap for the next 20 minutes, so I'll go ahead and put some background music on. I'll keep this in real time so that you can see everything, but really all I'm going to do is just finish out the lips, add some warmth to the nose, and add in that background and make a few adjustments here and there. But if you guys have any questions, let me know. I think in all, this portrait really only ended up being about 45 minutes long. It was fun, quick, and if you follow along with me and try your own version, I would love if you shared it with me or tagged me in it. I'd love to see it. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Bye.